joining us. Hello, my name is Lorelei Gonzalez. I am the program director of HERdacity, and I am very glad you chose to join us this morning because we're going to be talking about a really important topic of the power dynamics of inclusion. This is a really important conversation, especially for all of us in the workplace. We all know how important workplace inclusion can play a role in how we engage and how we have conversations. And I'm really glad you chose to take part in learning more about that today. If you're unfamiliar with HERdacity, HERdacity is a nonprofit, virtual-based platform dedicated to inspiring confidence in women to achieve their professional goals. Please continue to learn more about us on our website, HERdacity.org. Now, to lead us in this incredible conversation today on inclusion, I have a wonderful, wonderful guest joining us today. She is a trauma-informed diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, a doctoral candidate in educational equity, and the CEO of Buffalo Cloud Consulting, Christine Moses.
Hello.
Hello. So glad you could join us today. We are really excited for the content you have to share with us.
I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm looking forward to jumping right in, if that's all right.
Let's do it. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So then I'm going to go ahead and share, and let's launch into this work. So welcome to the Power Dynamics of Inclusion for HERdacity. I really appreciate this opportunity, and it is something that really speaks dearly to me because of the empowerment of women and the eradication of racism. So thank you for this invitation. Again, my name is Christine Moses. I'm a biracial, Black-white, cisgender woman who uses she, her pronouns. My work is centered on helping white, dominant culture organizations make equity pivots and systems change within their organizations to better serve and stop causing harm to Black, Indigenous, multiracial, and people of color. So I use BIMPOC to connote historically minoritized groups of people, and I will be specific in my language if I want to call out individual racial groups. The purpose of my land acknowledgement is to center the traditional Native inhabitants of the land upon which we live and acknowledge the genocide that occurred in the founding of the United States. I want to respectfully acknowledge the Chinook, the Clackamas, the Clatskanie, the Kalapuya, the Multnomah, and the Malala, people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I pay my personal respects to their elders, both past and present. So why this work? Well, my stated mission is to end racism by 2040. So we have 19 years to do this. So it is just so wonderful for me to be able to be here to talk about this and to build inclusive communities. In this process, I have found that I heal my wounds around racism and feeling less than. And then I can also prevent harm to current and future students and to staff members of color. So as you can see on the right-hand side, this is the motivation board. These are the people whose shoulders I stand on, who inform my work, and who give me inspiration every day to step in and have these types of conversations. So I'm not going to assume that we have the same level of familiarity with racism. So I'm going to start at the very base, at the beginning, so you'll understand where I come from in terms of how I look at racism and organizational change. So these next two slides are really basic, but I want to call out to us that race is a social construct. There is no biological reason for the values and characteristics we attribute and assign to people of different skin colors. like gender roles and money, race is totally made up. And yet it has life and death consequences. So who made it up? Let's look to our Constitution and the founding of our country. Land-owning white men are the center of power. Women and BIPOC were unable to vote, own land, and participate in business. It took hundreds of years to emancipate slaves and give women the right to vote. And in those hundreds of years, our culture, systems, institutions, and individuals who comprise them all have been swimming in a sea of racism, of valuing white lives, norms, behaviors, and cultures above people with darker skin tones. This is white supremacy culture. It's not just people wearing hoods. It is the over-policing of Black bodies, the firing of women who wear dreadlocks, and the disproportionate discipline of Black, Latinx, and poor students in our schools. This is the culture we live in. And it informs our systems and our structures, our governments, laws, and religions that then impose and support the institutions in which we live. And at the center is you. You are molded and culturated and taught to behave in a certain way and are rewarded or censured for the words you say and the way you act. All of this works together in our society, giving us, today we're gonna take a look at the individual and the individual within our institutions. I also like to start with definitions because definitions are critical to having a clear conversation about the topic. So I define diversity as having many types and varieties of people at the dance. Equity is ensuring everyone has what they need to dance. So people who have been historically minoritized are going to get more because they have been shut out and there are no bootstraps, and this is not a meritocracy. So we need to address the historical under resourcing of LGBTQ, of BIPOC, of all sorts of different types of groups of people. And then inclusion is changing the power structure so historically minoritized people can lead that dance. That's where true inclusion happens. So let's take a look at that. During this session, think about where you work. Put this presentation in that context. Some of this may be true for you from your perspective and some may not. Take what you can to support yourself in your work to help your organization become more human-centered and anti-racist. So as employers, what do you look for first when you walk into the lobby of your building? Do you look for the exits, the logos of the company, spaces where you can sit? What's on the walls? Who's in the room? Remember now back to when this was the first time that you walked into this lobby as a brand new employee, or put yourself in the place of a new employee. Think about what's going on in their minds as they enter your building. What are they thinking? Am I safe? Am I welcome here? Do I belong? Where are the exits? There's a whole different set of questions that are happening for a person who's coming into your organization. And what's on the walls will tell staff and customers who belongs, who doesn't, and sometimes why. So the history on the walls, whose history is it? Is it all white men who have been CEOs of this organization? Who are the donors? Who donates? We all know those donor walls. Service walls, who is in service to whom? And who is being served? I'm bringing this up because I want you to understand that according to Amara Perez, the environment space is not race neutral. So even walking into your building will tell new employees whether they belong or not. So if we do a deeper dive into the organization, we need to look to who is on the board of directors and who's in upper management. How did they get there? Is there a pattern by race, gender identity, by ability? Policies house the norms of an organization. There's written and spoken and unspoken norms of behavior, especially around time. Many times, the unspoken norms are the ones that people have problems with. Patterns of speech and hairstyles and clothing are the obvious ways that HR police BIMPOC staff. What are the other policies that do this kind of policing? Silos are the vertical departments of an organization. Does HR talk to accounting? Does marketing talk to research and design? Does research talk to sales? Each of these siloed departments lose the opportunity to truly collaborate because the people within the silos do not see the value of others outside of their expertise. And this plays into hierarchies and how hierarchies can minimize the opportunity for innovation and creativity and belonging. It also limits an organization to being nimble. And examining whether command and control really actually needs to happen is an incredible source of opportunity to create a welcoming environment. Also examine who gets promoted by race, by gender, and by ability. Creating an equitable, inclusive, welcoming organization is a lifelong journey because it begins with the individual. And I'll tell you, from scratch, it's a 3 to 5 year journey for an organization to become more inclusive. So inclusion is where the action of equity lives, in my opinion. And then we have to look at the types of power that are at play at work, in our society, and as individuals. And so it's really interesting in this work, in my work, to examine deeper the forms of power around expertise, around position, at work. Referent is like, is this person really charismatic? And you just get this awesome vibe from them and you'll follow them down the yellow brick road. So there's lots of different forms of power at work. We may not be able to name it, but we definitely sense it. And then in our society, there's rewards. It can be coercive. So public policy is the carrot and the stick, right? There's some rewards for some behaviors, and then there is coercion for other behaviors. And then there's also legitimate power, the power of the position. And so how does that position wield its rewards or coercion? We need to look at that. But what we have control over is the power of ourselves, the power within. And so that's where I'm going to center this talk, is that there are lots of different forms of power interacting in our days, but what we have control over is ourselves. So this is a real world example of what I mean by control over ourselves and understanding power as it plays in our society. So imagine you are me, a biracial cisgender woman, walking into this room. And I don't know anybody here. We'll call it a community meeting for creating. No. Let's call this a training. So here I am. I'm in this room for a training. I can see that there is a person at the podium. They have positional power and they probably have expertise power because it's a training. I'm here to learn. But I also have a vested interest in possibly getting my idea into the room. So where am I going to sit? For me, I choose sitting between the two white men on the left-hand side. When I walk into a room and I don't know anyone, I go and choose white men to sit near, to strike up a conversation, because I know that I'm going to be able to get my idea into the room through them. So it's a very calculated way of being in the world as a woman, as a multiracial woman, that I'm going to lean over, strike up a conversation, and then if I feel it's really necessary, I'm going to have that sidebar and I'm going to speak my idea to that person and say, hey, could you, what do you think about that? And ask them to speak it into the room. Yes, this is a strategy that I have developed over the years, that this is not what we want, right? We want to be able to hear, acknowledge, validate BIPOC women's voices, that we want to be able to make sure everyone is heard in meetings. And so I invite you to notice the next time that you walk into a room, who is sitting with whom? Whose ideas get validated? Whose ideas get amplified? Because that is really the critical thing. If you ever walk out of a meeting and say, thank you so much for raising that, I was feeling that same thing, you have missed an opportunity to validate that person and amplify their idea or their voice or their concern. And that's where true allyship lives. If you're going to be an ally to advancing and welcoming and including people, if you ever walk out of that room and lean over and say, thanks for saying that, I'm so glad you did, then, and you didn't amplify that voice, then you have missed an incredible opportunity to make that a standard practice and a culture change within your organization. So I just invite you to notice who gets interrupted, notice who gets amplified, and to support BIPOC people and to support people who are gender fluid, queer, trans, be cognizant of the people who have been historically minoritized and make sure their voices are amplified within these meetings, because the intersectionality of being Black and gender nonconforming is to receive a double dose of microaggressions on a daily basis. So how do you interrupt and disrupt the status quo? Because that's what we're trying to do. How to do that? Slow down. Slow your thinking to empower yourself. Implicit biases live in fast decisions, those fast, do I get on the elevator or not? Or, do I step to the side when I'm walking downtown? In those fast decisions lives your implicit bias. Self-reflection is the only way to make better decisions because you can include others in the process. And the biases that you have are the stories that you tell yourself when you're sitting there at the mall and you're watching people walk by, and that little story kicks in. Oh, I wonder where they're from, or why did they wear that, or I can't believe they, blah, blah, blah. Those are your biases at work. And paying attention to those biases begins to interrupt them, begins to help you identify how you're making decisions, because implicit bias is unconscious. And you can be consciously trying to disrupt behavior that is racist, that is othering, and still do it at the same time. And the way to do that is to slow down. Pay attention to the stories you tell yourself and identify the assumptions that you have about other groups of people that are not like you. I actually was so grateful to a hiring committee once. I was a director of communications, and I was hiring for an editor's position. And I had a team of 3 other people. We interviewed great candidates, and I'm like, I want candidate A. They are so awesome, and I think they're wonderful. And my team was like, no, you really want candidate B. And I'm like, why? Because candidate B is the person who loves words, wants to sit in a cubicle all day and edit, loves to write, and wants to be in an enclosed environment. And candidate A, it was so much more like me, outgoing, bubbly, community oriented. And herein lies my bias for picking somebody who's a lot like me, right? And thank goodness I listened to my team and picked candidate B, because 13 years later, they're still in that job. And it fit them perfectly, and it was the right person for the right job. So my bias was at work to, wanting to pick the bubbly, perky person who's community oriented, and thank goodness for my team to tell me no. And thank goodness I listened. So all of that was at work. And I need other people to interrupt and to help me be that better hiring manager. Even who do you sit with at lunch allows you to examine the biases that are at work. One of the best exercises is who is identifying your trusted 10 who are not your family members. Who are they? Write down their names. And it can be from over time, it can be, recent people, but who are those trusted 10? And then note their gender and their race, their class, and their education level. If they are all the same, you have an echo chamber. And that is not how you are able to break out and become a more inclusive person. This is a way of identifying that close circle of friends and then saying, who's missing? So for me, I have 2 Black cisgender women, 1 Black gender fluid person, 1 white gender fluid person, 1 Indigenous 2 spirits person, a white cisgender woman, one Latinx cisgender woman, one Muslim cisgender woman, and 2 white cisgender men. And my trusted 10. Who's missing? Black men. I'm missing Black men in my trusted 10. And so here is an opportunity for me to do my work on building understanding, building relationships, going out of my comfort zone to be able to find those perspectives and those relationships that I'm missing that I feel are important. And so there's something going on working in me that is prohibiting me from building that type of trusting relationship. I need to identify that. So also in the slowing down, it allows us to connect to our purpose and our meaning and our belonging to ourselves and each other. I have to belong to myself first before I can belong to other people and belong with other people. And the goal is to create wholeness and balance and to center our humanity at work. One resource I have found very helpful is CoActive Leadership. And the authors, Kimsey and House, really center this in personal responsibility. When we choose to be responsible for what is happening around us, we're able to work together in a way that includes and utilizes the unique talents of everyone. And it is about being together in action, in both, and not either or, but always both and then also being in sync in relationship and connected to each other, not driven by productivity and disconnected from our humanity. So part of this work is recognizing internally that things take longer than usual, than you would think, that it is, that in our white supremacy cultures, perfection is critical, and actually what we want is good, and that, you know, productivity is the all-important driver. We're really quality relationships and being able to turn ourselves toward quality instead of quantity, and compassion instead of drive is really what we're trying to do. And through CoActive Leadership, we can begin to develop these skills, especially if we look at that everyone is a leader when they own their own experience. When I'm not delegating my happiness to my boss or to my boss's boss or to the company, when I take responsibility for myself, I can then co-create, co-activate what I'm trying to create in the world, which for me is a sense of compassion and a sense of humanity. You can generate your own personal power when you take responsibility for your experience. And so I do recommend CoActive Leadership, because this book really has helped me begin to look at the leader within myself, the leader in front. We have all sorts of experience with people leading out front, but what does it mean to lead behind, to empower people to be able to move them forward, or leading from the side, where you're in co-creation with someone and that you both take full responsibility for the outcome of the project. And then leader in the field is someone that is looking out front and is out there examining what's happening out front in order to bring that information back. I highly recommend this book. So the business case for inclusion, I think we know this, but I always like to remind us that our goal is to center our humanity within a capitalist system. It's difficult, and it doesn't, I have never had the experience yet of working in an organization that can do that. So I think we're building something new here. That valuing diverse perspectives means innovation and creativity, and that it can thrive in our organizations. But we need to do more than just value. We need to actually put those voices in leadership positions. And businesses that value, foster, and nurture those multiple perspectives outperform monoculture organizations. So, creating an equitable and inclusive environment. Acknowledge your identity and how it plays out in the work environment. Reflect on your own assumptions and the choices you make as a manager, as a staff member, and as a friend. Change the power structures to embrace co-leadership by supporting other women who speak up. Silence is violence. I cannot emphasize this enough, that if people do not speak up, amplify, and support people's BIPOC voices, genderqueer voices, the harm that happens is lifelong and lasting. If you take anything away from this, silence is violence. And then assess your office for culturally sustaining artifacts, posters, art, and really examine whose culture is centered in your organization. And then again, center and support BIPOC cultures by supporting their voices. If you're a member of the dominant culture, volunteer with BIPOC organizations to support your growth in their cultures, because volunteering is a beautiful place to begin to understand, to begin to connect, and to begin to build those relationships. And then remember, the environment is the first indicator for BIPOC staff to determine if they can feel and if they feel they can belong, and if they feel they can be successful. And that culture change takes 3 to 5 years. So as I'm wrapping up here, the platinum rule: do unto others as they want done to them. You have to put yourself into other people's shoes, and the only way to do that is to be in authentic relationship. So those are my words of wisdom for the day.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was incredible. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So now is your time as an audience to interact with Christine. If you have questions for her and you'd like to explore more of the amazing breadth and depth of information that she brings to the table in this conversation today, please do so now. You can utilize the Q&A feature or the chat window. Send your questions to Christine. So Christine, this has been an amazing and really powerful conversation. Mm-hmm. How did you personally launch into your professional journey in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So I was in Austin, Texas, and I was consulting. I was a freelance consultant and working on strategic plans and helping nonprofits. And I met the executive director of Caritas of Austin, and they specifically work with the unhoused. And their executive director invited me to create their equity journey. And I was like, I am not an equity expert here. And Jo Catherine was like, you have 50 years of lived experience, you can do this. And so I started studying, and my equity career was launched. I spent many years trying not to talk about race. and to not rock the boat and to not acknowledge difference and culture. And in that invitation of stepping in and leading equity conversations, I have found my liberation, and I will always be so grateful to Jo Catherine Quinn for inviting me to do this work. So didn't know I was on the journey, didn't know I had a passion for it. And then over the last 10 years, it's just totally changed my life.
Well, over the last 10 years, I imagine you are the creator of some uncomfortable situations for certain folks as you go into organizations to start these equity journeys. What are some of the larger hurdles that you see in that beginning culture shift?
Well, it's really important that the leader of the organization, the executive director, the CEO, the president, is on the equity journey themselves, and that they have a clear idea of what they want. That it is in their personal journey, it is in their positional power that they are able then to bring people on board. If that is not in place, if they think they want to raise awareness, there is no such thing as raising awareness. There's just no such thing as that. You're on the journey or you're not on the journey. And CEOs who want to raise awareness are actually going to cause more harm than stepping into the work wholesale and saying, I want an equitable, diverse, inclusive environment. And then together they begin to build their personal understandings as an entire leadership group, and then begin a year or two later setting what those targets are and how would equity show up. You don't start with the targets, you actually start with the personal journey of understanding how race works in America.
Okay, well, let's get into that personal journey for a moment. Let's say you're on a big team and you notice some challenges. How can you feel empowered to step in?
Yep. Well, there are costs. You do have to recognize that there are costs when you step in. But if you're the more you step in, the stronger your muscles, the stronger your equity muscles get, the more you have experience in interrupting, and that even in amplifying people's voices that have not been heard, that is an act of support, of allyship, of actually being able to begin to change the culture. So it is baby steps. It's not blowing up the whole meeting, but it is inviting people in possibly afterwards, or calling people out in the middle of the meeting. So it really depends on the situation and on your capacity for being uncomfortable. Knowing that conflict is a great place for change. It is a great place to be able to create the environment that we want. That conflict should not be avoided at all costs. That is a big place where we can find change within our organizations, is to step in and to be uncomfortable.
Okay, so I have an uncomfortable example for you. You've already mentioned having leadership be on board. What if leadership isn't on board and they are a perpetrator of microaggressions for their team? What can a team member do?
This is where ERGs come in, right? The employee resource groups. This is where affinity groups come in, because an affinity group is a group of people who have similar demographic characteristics and can create strategies to either circumvent, work around, or disrupt the perpetrator of microaggressions. It is a process of calling out and calling in to the work. And then if you have turnover within your organization in, 1 to 2 to 3 years of people of color, you have a manager who has a problem. If you need to look at the numbers and see who's successful within that manager's group. So going around to HR, going higher up in the chain of command can also be beneficial, but sometimes you just have to walk away. I've had to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Staying on the topic of challenges from executive leadership, when problems are occurring and there's some sort of need for an apology, and maybe the apologies are used to negate any real cultural change. We have a member who would like to know that, who would like to ask you, how do we deal with apologies when it's being used to avoid making real change, or just to or can continue to cause harm by just apologizing for it and moving on instead of really addressing the challenge?
Yeah, that's where, again, I think the employee resource groups and the affinity groups really help, because you're not alone in challenging that false apology, right? That in a business environment, if you can produce statistics, if you can produce data that says here's historic harm, it helps to be able to enlighten the story. But really what you need is your leadership to be able to understand your personal stories, that qualitative data, that personal stories are the things that we need to address. And so it is about holding leadership accountable, either through newsletters within the organization or through meetings, or, there's different ways of working with HR to be able to do that. And also getting to the board as a very, very, very last resort. It's a public statement about how dysfunctional that the organization can be. But so I'm always looking for ways to be able to build relationships and call people into the work. But sometimes as a last resort, you have to just call them out.
Just continuing on this topic for just a moment, what happens when the organization is very small? Maybe they have an outsourced HR department. Maybe they do not have access to ERGs.
Yeah.
What can one do?
Then it's a personal relationship where you have to go back to them and say, that's not enough. And sometimes people need you as the person who's been harmed to tell them what it is that they need to do. I know that is excruciatingly hard. You as the person have been harmed. And now I'm going to have to teach the person who's harmed me what it is they have to do in their personal life, in their personal journey, in how they treat me at work, on all these different levels. But that's, in a small organization, the only way to change is to be in that conflict and tell them, this is what I need next, or let's try and do this together.
I think we've, as a culture, as a society, have been seeing a lot of that, but that seems to place a disproportionate burden on folks of color or groups, minority groups, like women who might be, one of the few folks in the office experiencing those challenges, those microaggressions. We're constantly putting the burden on them to educate others.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. Which is why my strategy for getting a white man to speak my idea into the room works a lot.
Right.
But that's not what we want, right? We want to be able to actually have people stop harming us. So I may call in allies. I may call in other white men or other people that are similar to the perpetrator to say, help me be able to talk to this person. Okay. Because a lot of times the message is going to land, is not going to land. It's not going to land well from me, but it might land well from somebody who is very similar to the perpetrator.
So bringing in an ally to some of those conversations could be helpful.
Yep.
Thank you for that. Now, when it comes to the personal change, how can we start intentionally slowing down when you're, you mentioned like fast is when we make those unconscious bias decisions. How can we start intentionally slowing down when making those decisions, when listening to those personal narratives? And what should we do if we make a quick decision and realize that it was based in some unconscious bias?
Yeah. So breathing is the key. Breathing, just slowing down our breathing, right? So if I'm, as a trauma-informed equity person, I always center our breathing and counting to 10. In just before I answer, I'm going to take a big deep breath and I'm going to count to 10. And this really helps to take that first idea and to not speak it, and then to take the second idea and examine it, and then be able to actually speak what I want to say, not what my biases are going to say. So being able to interrupt, to stop, to breathe, just doing that will be able to bring you back into your prefrontal cortex and out of your amygdala, out of the lizard brain, to be able to actually say what you want to say.
Take you out of reaction.
Right, exactly.
Got it. Thank you very much. And to just dig into that just quickly, when we make a bad decision, based on bias, how can we correct either in the moment or later with our behaviors?
Yeah.
Or whatnot.
So apologies are critical. And when I catch myself, I try and apologize at the moment. So when I walk in and I say, hey, you guys, that's actually a microaggression to women and gender fluid people.
Thank you.
And so I still make that mistake. And in that moment, I'm like, I apologize for doing that and move on. Some people will call me out in the moment, and I will deeply take that in and appreciate how I am getting feedback. I'm getting feedback. That's what I'm getting from other people on how my words have landed. Inviting feedback is so critical. And so in the apology, I might get feedback, and I might not get forgiveness. And that's my work to work on, right? Therein lies my learning. The person who I've harmed does not have to give me forgiveness. They don't even have to acknowledge my apology. But I know that I continue to have to work on not causing microaggressions and being able to examine when I cause harm, I apologize. I may also send a follow-up email. I may get a response, or I may not get a response. And I have to be okay with that. But in the apologizing and cleaning up my mess, taking responsibility for my mess, that's where power and learning lives.
Love that. There has been a lot of power and a lot of learning in this past hour, and I want you to know how much we really appreciate your time and expertise in this conversation. If y'all are interested in following up with Christine, she's going to throw her information up on the screen. I highly recommend connecting with her on LinkedIn, all the places. Check out her website. She has a bunch of amazing resources in general, as well as for organizations. Maybe you've heard something today that you'd like to take to your company. She would be a great resource for you. I want to thank you all for joining us today. HERdacity is really happy to be able to share these conversations with you. You can check out in the chat. Oh, Christine.
Just thank you so much.
Our absolute pleasure. And I want to thank you all for taking the survey. If you haven't yet, please do that. That helps us with, grants and things like that. Now, if you heard things like, ooh, I want to learn more about microaggressions, guess what? We have a candid conversation coming up next month on microaggressions. Highly recommend you check it out. The link for our upcoming events is in the chat. You can click on that and sign up today. I'd love to see your faces there. We have some more amazing webinars in our webinar series. We do one webinar a month, except for in July. We'll be having a special event in July. Do stay tuned for that. It's going to be a very exciting one. Every one of you has been amazing today. Christine, doubly so. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next time.